In this video, we're going to look at GCSE English Literature, Power and Conflict Poetry, focusing on the poem Kamikaze, which was written by Beatrice Garland. And it was written in 2013. So unlike the soldier poets of World War I, Garland is a modern poet who uses her clinical background to explore the psychological impact of war, focusing on the tension between national duty and the individual's desire to live. It's based on the Japanese suicide missions during World War II, and it follows a pilot who embarks on a one-way journey to crash his plane into an enemy ship, but chooses to abort the mission and return home after being overwhelmed by the beauty of the natural world below him. The main message is that war can destroy a person even if they survive the battlefield. The poem highlights that cultural honor and shame are as lethal as any weapon, and by choosing life over a heroic death, the pilot is shunned by his family, resulting in a silent, social execution that erodes his humanity. The huge flag of the sea and the dark prince, the tuna, symbolize the immense hypnotic power of nature that lures the pilot back to life. The irony lies in the ending. Though he avoided a fiery death at sea, his family's silent treatment made him wish he had died in the cockpit, proving that for some, the better way to die was the one he didn't take. Key ideas in the poem are as follows. So we have individual versus state and duty. The pilot is caught between the powerful incantations of nationalistic propaganda and his own sensory experience. The state demands a one-way journey into history, but his personal instinct for survival, triggered by the sight of the silver fish and the translucent sea, forces a rebellion against his shaven-head military identity. We'll look at the power of nature. So nature acts as the turning point of the poem. The huge flag of the shoals of fish and the dark prince muscular dangerous tuna represent a world that is vibrant and eternal, contrasting with the grey mechanical world of war. It is the beauty of the shore and the pebbles that ultimately enchant him back to life. The cruelty of honour and shame. So the poem explores how a heroic culture can be colder than the sea. Upon his return, the pilot is treated as though he no longer existed, and this silent rejection by his wife and children shows that in a society built on honour, survival is seen as betrayal, and shame is a weapon that can kill a person's spirit while their body remains alive. We look at the loss of voice and legacy. So the poem structure shifts from the pilot's perspective to his daughter's storytelling, showing how he was silenced by his community. He is never allowed to speak for himself, and the final irony reflects on which had been the better way to die, suggesting that the slow social death he enjoyed at home was more painful than the quick patriotic death that he escaped. Let's look at the structure of the poem. So it's in 7 stanzas of equal length, known as sestets, and the tight control structure that reflects the rigid expectations of the Japanese military and the powerful incantations of the state. However, the use of enjambment, which is sentences flowing across lines and stanzas, contrasts with this, representing the pilot's internal struggle as his personal memories break free from his disciplined training. Is also in free verse and natural rhythm. So unlike the rigid rhyme of exposure, Garland uses no formal rhyme scheme. This creates a conversational storytelling tone as the daughter narrates the past. It makes the pilot's experience feel more human and personal, contrasting with the cold mechanical duty he was expected to perform. It looks at shifting perspectives, so the poem moves from the pilot's journey in third person to the daughter's direct memories in first person. This shift creates a sense of detachment, so the pilot is so isolated by his shame that he doesn't even get to tell the story on his own. His life is seen only through the eyes of others. The final couplet are in italics, so the shift into italics at the end marks a change in voice's daughter's own reflection. The final lines conclude the poem on a somber, questioning note, and this line emphasizes the irony of his survival. Though he chose life, the silent treatment from his family meant he suffered a slow emotional death, leaving the reader to wonder which fate was truly worse. Let's have a look at the context of the poem. So, it's based on the divine wind culture. So, Garland explores the historical context of the Japanese Tokotai suicide squads, and the term kamikaze refers to a 13th century storm that saved Japan from invasion. Pilots were expected to be that literal storm. To survive was not just a failure of duty, but a violation of a sacred spiritual mission. It looks at post war social stigma. So, the poem is based on the real world aftermath for pilots who returned. In Japanese society at the time, the shame of survival brought extreme dishonor to the family name, and the cultural presence was so intense that family members often felt forced to disown the survivor to protect their own social standing. It looks at nature as a catalyst. So whilst Owen's nature is a killer and exposure, Garland's nature is a savior, as the green blue translucent sea and the dark shoals of fishes acts as a psychological anchor, pulling the pilot out of his indoctrinated state and back into the physical reality of the world he's about to leave. It looks at the clinical perspective. So, as a poet with a background in the NHS and psychology, Garland focuses on the intergenerational trauma. The poem isn't just about the pilot, it's about how his shame was passed down to his children, who learned to be silent and to live as though he had never returned. Let's look at the actual poem. So here is a Kamikaze poem. You're more than welcome to pause the video, have a read, and press play when you're ready to go on. Let's do a line by line analysis. So, her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a shaven head full of powerful incantations. This is an example of symbolism, as sunrise references the rising sun of the Japanese flag, linking the pilot to national pride. It's a metaphor, as powerful incantations suggest the pilot has been under a spell of propaganda and patriotic brainwashing. The method is a shaven head is a visual symbol of a soldier who has surrendered his individuality to the state and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. Euphemism shows one-way journey is a polite way of saying a suicide mission, and the method is that the noun history shows the pilot's desire for eternal honor and glory, which was promised to those who died for the emperor. But halfway, she said, she thought, recounting it later to her children, shows a shift in narrative, as the use of third person and the daughter's voice creates detachment. This indicates that the father's own voice has been erased from history because of his shame. He must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting, is a simile comparing boats to bunting such as celebratory flags. This creates irony as he's on a mission of death, but the world below is like a celebration of life. On a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them arching in swathes like a huge flag waved first one day, then the other in a figure of eight, is visual imagery as translucent and green-blue creates a vibrant sensory world. The simile in the huge flag of fish mimics the Japanese flag but is a natural one, and the method this suggests that the power of nature is more mesmerizing and powerful than the political flag that he is supposed to die for. The dark shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun, show sibilance as the repeated S sounds mimic the gentle movement of water, and this creates a calm, hypnotic tone, explaining why the pilot was enchanted into changing his mind. And remember how he and his brothers waiting on the shore built cairns of pearl grey pebbles has a flashback and anaphora as the pilot here is remembering his childhood, and the cairns, which are piles of stone used as markers or memorials, act as foreshadowing as he's thinking of death and memory whilst he's still alive. Bringing their father's boat safe to the shore, and the turbulent inrush of breakers bringing their father's boat safe shows repetition, as the word safe is repeated to emphasize his desire for security and family. And the enjambment, which shows sentences running over lines, reflects his racing thoughts as he decides to turn the plane around. The loose silver of white bait and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous, shows the tuna is a metaphor as it's literally called a dark prince. And the caesura, which is the full stop after dangerous, is the first one in the poem, marking the moment of his decision. The tuna represents the muscular power of nature that demands respect, which is more respect than the military leaders in this case. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence is a volta, also known as a turning point in the poem, as the tone shifts from beautiful nature to cold human rejection. And the method is that the silent treatment represents his social execution in society. The neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed, is a simile. As though he no longer existed shows that for his community he was better off dead, and this highlights the theme of shame versus honour. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Is the final irony as the poem ends with a haunting thought, and the rhetorical reflection suggests that the death of his dignity and family life was more painful than the death he avoided in the plane. Let's doing a section by section analysis now. So stanza 1 shows the ritual of departure. What happens is the daughter describes her father preparing for his suicide mission. He's followed the military rituals, shaving his head and carrying basic supplies, whilst appearing mentally consumed by nationalistic propaganda. The powerful incantations represent the psychological pressure of the state, and the mention of a one-way journey into history establishes the high stakes. He's expected to trade his life for eternal glory, highlighting the theme of patriotism versus self. The metaphor as the main part here in incantations and the symbolism in shaven head. Stanzas 2 to 4 show the enchantment of life, and what happens is whilst flying, the pilot looks down at the sea. Instead of seeing a target, he sees fishing boats and shoals of fish moving in the water. He remembers his childhood on the shore with his brothers watching the silver fish and the translucent sea. Here, nature acts as a powerful distraction. The beauty of the green-blue world reminds him of the value of life, breaking the spell of the military. The huge flag of the fish creates an irony. The natural world is more captivating than the political flag he's supposed to die for. This is an example of simile, like bunting, and sibilance and visual imagery. Stanzas 5 to 6 show dangerous choice, and what happens is the memories of his father's boat coming home safe trigger a realization. He sees a tuna, described as a dark prince, and the raw power of the ocean. He desires to turn his plane around and return home. The repetition of the word safe emphasizes this shift from wanting glory to wanting survival. The tuna represents the muscular and dangerous reality of nature, which is ultimately more respected by the pilot than his military orders. Techniques to highlight a repetition in safe, caesura in the full stop after the tuna description, and metaphor in dark prints. Stanzas 7 to 8 show the silent execution, and what happens here is that the narrative shifts to the aftermath. The pilot returns, but is treated as a ghost by his wife and neighbours. Even his children are taught to ignore him. The poem ends with the daughter reflecting that he might have eventually preferred to the quick death of the mission. This illustrates a social death caused by shame. The silent treatment is a weapon used by his community to punish his cowardice, and the final irony reflects that whilst he saved his life, he lost his soul and his place in his family. Techniques to highlight are the shift in narrative voice, irony, and rhetorical reflection. Let's look at the overall interpretation. So, Beatrice Garland's Kamikaze explores a profound disconnect between the nationalistic myth of a noble suicide and the agonizing reality of a survivor being destroyed by his own community. Through a transition from vibrant sensory imagery to a cold, silent domestic reality, the poem depicts the pilot as a man who chooses the beauty of the natural world over the powerful incantations of the state, only to find himself a ghost in his own home. The poem suggests that cultural shame is an indelible ice on the family unit, transforming the innocent love of his children into a learned, silent rejection. By the end, the realization that he no longer existed to those he loved reveals a bitter truth that cultural honor is a lethal force, as the pilot is defeated by social stigma rather than the allied enemy. The muscular, dangerous presence of the tuna confirms that whilst nature and time is stronger than humans, the human capacity for cruelty through silence is equally absolute. This leaves the witness and the reader with the eyes cold realization that irony exposes the ruler's foolishness, showing that the glory of a one-way journey into history is a lie, that for those who turn back ends in a shriveled and socially sanctioned psychological death. Let's look at what poems we can compare with Kamikaze then. So we can compare Kamikaze and Poppies together. Similarities are the perspective on the non-competent. So, neither poem takes place on a battlefield. Kamikaze is narrated by a daughter looking back at her father's choice, while Poppies is narrated by a mother remembering her son. Both poets focus on the emotional and psychological fallouts of conflict rather than the physical violence of war. Another similarity is memory and domestic imagery. Both poems use ordinary domestic details to ground the massive tragedy of war. Garland uses fishing boats and pebbles to represent the life the pilot couldn't leave behind, whilst Weir uses cat hairs, buttonholes, and individual war graves to show how war permeates every aspect of a home. Another similarity is the conflict between duty and love. So both poems depict a struggle between the national requirement of a soldier and the personal needs of a family. In Kamikaze, the pilot's duty to his country conflicts with his love for his life and family, whereas in Poppies, the mother's duty to let her son grow up and serve his country conflicts with her maternal instinct to keep him safe. Differences include the concept of return. So in Poppies, the son is physically gone and likely dead. The mother is left at a war memorial leaning against it like a wishbone, hoping to hear his playground voice. In Kamikaze, the father physically returns, but he's treated as if he's dead, and his survival is a social death, which Garland suggests is a more painful irony than the mother's grief in Poppies. Another difference is the role of silence. So silence in Poppies is a result of absence, the son isn't there to speak. Whereas in Kamikaze, silence is a weapon used by the family to punish the father. My mother never spoke again. The silence in Kamikaze is an active choice of the community to inflict shame, whereas in Poppies, it's the heavy silence of mourning. Another difference is the cultural context versus individual grief. So Kamikaze is deeply rooted in Japanese cultural honor and the powerful incantations of the state, making the pilot's struggle a clash with society. Poppies is a more universal, intimate portrait of grief, focusing on the trucks, darts, pleats of a mother's internal pain rather than the rigid expectations of a specific nature. We can also compare it with checking out my history. So, similarities are as follows. A similarity is a struggle against powerful incantations. So, both poets depict characters who are restricted by the history that they are told. In Kamikaze, the pilot is under the spell of powerful incantations, propaganda, whereas in Checking Out My History, the speaker is blinded by a Eurocentric education, bandage up me eye with me own history. Both poems show how states use stories to control people's minds. The use of nature to reclaim identity is another similarity, because in both poems, natural imagery represents a truth that is more real than the military or colonial version of the world. The pilot sees the translucent sea and silver fish, and Agard uses the mountain dream, fire woman, and healing star to describe his Caribbean heroes. Nature provides the light needed to see through the state's lies. Another similarity is breaking free from a narrative, so both poems feature a turning point where the individual rejects what they have been taught. The pilot turns its plane around, and the speaker in Agard's poem decides to carve out my own identity. Both poems celebrate the moment an individual chooses their own path over the one forced upon them. Differences between both poems. So one difference is the outcome of rebellion. In Checking Out My History, the rebellion is empowering. The speaker is active and defiant, ending the poem with a sense of pride as he carves his own future. In Kamikaze, the rebellion is tragic. Even though the pilot makes a brave choice to live, he is shunned and silenced, ending the poem in a social death. Another difference is the tone of the voice. So Agard's tone is angry, rhythmic, and rebellious, using non-standard English and Caribbean phonetic spellings to reject English rules, whereas Garland's tone is melancholy, detached, and quiet, using standard English and a third-person narrative to show how the pilot has been pushed to the margins of his own life. The role of the community is also shown. So in Agard's poem, the community, which was the British education system, is something to be fought against and overcome. In Kamikaze, which is the community, which is the family and the neighbours, is the force that ultimately destroys the pilot, and Agard finds strength in his heritage, whereas the pilot's abandoned by his. Let's look at key quotes to revise for Kamikaze then. So we have a few here. We have a shaven head full of powerful incantations, shows metaphor and symbolism, and the shaven head is a visual ritual that of surrendering individuality, as the incantation suggests he has been put under a spell by patriotic propaganda, showing that nationalistic duty can override human instinct. The little fishing boats, strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, show simile and irony. Comparing the boats to bunting, celebratory flags, is deeply ironic. So whilst the pilot is on a mission of death, the world below is a celebration of life. The translucent sea proves that the beauty of nature is more powerful than the military orders in his head. Shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swivel towards the sun, show sibilance and sensory imagery, so the S sounds create a fluid, hypnotic rhythm that mimics the movement of the ocean. This creates an enchanting atmosphere, explaining why the pilot was lured back to life. Nature is a vibrant force that makes his one-way journey seem unnatural. The Dark Prince, muscular, dangerous, shows metaphor and caesura, describing the tuna as a dark prince gives nature a sense of royalty and lethal power. The full stop caesura mid-poem marks the moment of his decision. It hints that the natural world is a true authority, and nature and time is stronger than humans and their petty wars. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again. In his presence is an example of enjambment and tone shift. The flow of the poem breaks into a cold domestic reality, as the silence is a weapon used by the family to punish his survival. It proves that the cultural shame can be more destructive than the battlefield, resulting in a social death. He must have wondered which had been the better way to die, shows rhetorical reflection and irony. The final line suggests that by choosing to live, the pilot actually endured a longer, more painful death of the spirit. It proves that irony exposes the foolish foolishness. The state promised a heroic death, but the culture ensured that even in survival he would be shriveled and forgotten.